bridge. It wasn't just over. It crossed the bridge a long time. So to have it afterwards is no great surprise. Finkelstein argued that the kind of pottery they're finding before the Shishak attack only was developed at the time of Jezreel in the 9th century BC. And basically the guys at Tel Rehov are saying, no, we have evidence of that same stuff before the Shishak attack in the 10th century BC. Also, they make the same sort of argument that Amnon Ben-Tor did, and that is the stratification of Tel Rehov is such that there's not enough time to use Finkelstein's chronology to account for everything. Now, Jerusalem, of course, is the acid test. What do we know about 10th century Jerusalem? And the answer was, when Finkelstein first came up with his chronology, the answer was almost nothing. We had very little 10th century BC pottery from Jerusalem. The thing is, Jerusalem has been continuously rebuilt. And because of that, people tend to frown on it when you start digging into their foundations or whatever. So it was hard to do any excavation there. You could only do it in certain places. But some recent excavations have happened that are really cool. So you see where Jerusalem is. Here is an artist depiction of David's Jerusalem. Please remember that David's Jerusalem was very small, and it was only the southern spur of the city. So the modern Jerusalem is mainly up the hill and up at the top. David's Jerusalem didn't include that. David's Jerusalem was down on the southern spur of the hill. It was very small, only about 20 acres. Here is this is one of the very few places that has been known for a long time that has been excavated carefully. And what they found here, this weird complex of buildings, is a big retaining wall holding up the side of the city, and then some buildings built on top of it. And they did some careful analysis of the dating and came up with something like this. So all the yellowish colored, that's Canaanite, that predates the Israelites, predates David. Okay, so that all was there already. Then along came around David's time, and these other things that were built on top of it, Achiel's house, etc. These structures probably dated from around David's time, but there's debate about that. Then this stuff, the purple stuff, was built much later. So now you can see them side by side. So it's this stuff, these twin pillars, that's Achiel's house, and a couple of things along here, maybe 10th century, but that's it. So we have almost nothing. Although an interesting aside, so they've just now, in the last year, they've totally changed how you visit this whole area. And it's really cool. It's really wonderful what they did. Just to the south of the picture I just showed you, you enter a little room and you go down this staircase into this kind of cave area. One of the tricky things, when you build a wall and a gate, okay, you're pretty well protected now, right? And if an enemy comes in here and besieges you and brings, broomsticks, you got to be able to survive a while, don't you? So what do you need? You need food and water. Food is not that hard. You can store food, but water, that's a real challenge. So how do you get water inside a walled city? There's another rule of history. Water wants to go down. Right? Water wants to go down. But if you want protection, you want to go up. We have a conflict of interest here. Right? Water's not interested in following you up. So, how do you deal with it? Somehow you've got to try to figure out a way to get water from inside your walls. But you want to be up while the water's down. How do you pull it off? Well, people get creative. What they did here was at the foot, so let me go back. Okay, basically right here is a spring. Pretty potent spring, puts out a lot of water. That's the main water source for Jerusalem. So what they did was this predates David, they buried it so you couldn't see it from the outside. The enemy didn't know it was there. And then they figured out a way to get at it from inside the wall. So what they did, you have to go down here. Here is a vertical shaft. So once you go down, you're inside the wall, you go down, and there's this vertical shaft. And that vertical shaft goes down to the spring. And you can lower a bucket and scoop out of there. It's called Warren's shaft because Warren, he was the guy who found it. Okay, he was the archaeologist who found it. Now, by the way, if you read your Samuel carefully, David, when he conquered Jerusalem, how did he get in? Through the water system. Remember that? Joab got in through the water system. How did he get in through the water system? Nobody knows for sure, but when Warren found this, he said, oh, I wonder, could a person get into the water system, somehow figure out a gap in there, get in here and climb up that shaft, and then come in and open the gates to David's army, which is basically what happened. Well, is this the shaft? Is this how he got in? Well, Warren, being a good skeptical archaeologist, said, I won't believe it unless I can do it. Now, he was kind of fat, so it was a little hard. But he hired some professional rock climbers who taught him chimney techniques, and he eventually got in there and wiggled his way up and climbed up the shaft. And when he got up to the top, he said, just maybe. Just maybe that is how it happened, so who knows. Actually, there's been some recent evidence done with excavations that suggest that maybe this wasn't the way they got in. We're not sure. There's actually several access points because there's lots of natural and unnatural holes in the rocks in this area. But this is possible. This is possibly how he got in. By the way, when you go there, and you must go there, it's very cool. And you go to the overlook and you look down Warren's shaft. Would you do me a favor? My glasses fell off. They're still down there. I want my glasses back. That's what I'm saying. I'm not joking. Okay. Here's the spring, the Gihon Spring, it's called. And you can go to it today. It's the entrance to Hezekiah's Tunnel. Now it's all part of the same complex. We'll talk about Hezekiah's Tunnel later. Now, just up the hill, so what I call the Ophel, that Canaanite retaining wall, right at the top of it, just 2 years ago, an archaeologist found what you're seeing here. So that, here she is. And I'm blanking out on her name right now. I'll remember in a minute. And right here is that retaining wall. So it's right there. And you see these really big, thick walls. This is a huge, fancy building. And as she started to work her way around, she found a number of fancy things, and she is finding in the foundation trenches of these walls 10th century pottery. Now, also some older pottery, which is interesting, because it suggests that you have a 10th century remodel of maybe a 13th century building. This is a palace complex. There's no question about it. The question is it David's palace? And the best arguments to date seem to suggest that what David did was he remodeled a Canaanite palace that was already there and added to it and whatever in the 10th century. So that seems to be the best evidence anyhow. You can see from the size of her relative to the archaeology just how big it is. Here's some people working on it. Here's David keeping an eye on things. Very careful. They also found a fancy capital for a pillar, so you can see some idea of the ornateness of it. This is all now captured in this beautifully new built visitor center, and you kind of go downstairs and you can kind of wander through these rooms and that kind of stuff, and you see this. This is all brand new, and this is really blowing up Finkelstein's argument, because not only is it, and now we have another piece of monumental architecture attributed to somebody older than Solomon, right? So that's making it more problematic. Now, what about the temple, you might ask? Did you ask that? What about the temple? Solomon, right? He was the guy who built the temple. What about the temple? Well, the thing is, it's really sensitive there. By international agreement, the Temple Mount is controlled by the Waqf, the Muslim religious authority. It is the third holiest site in the Islamic world. You can see it at the top there, the Dome of the Rock. And therefore, excavations are not going to happen there. And also, remember, the temple was destroyed. Solomon's temple was destroyed, then rebuilt during the time of Cyrus, and then remodeled on a lavish scale by King Herod at the time of Jesus, and then destroyed again in 70 AD, and then rebuilt by Muslims into this form. So you have a lot of destruction and remodeling and stuff going on. So it's we're asking about the oldest evidence, the Solomon's temple. What evidence do we have of that? Well, we actually have a little tiny bit. Right here is a stairway. The stairway is right here. Now, you can see a couple of things from this picture. One is you can see that this stairway is out of line from that part of the wall, right? That wall is going this way. It should continue straight like this, but it kind of goes crooked just for this little ways. What's up with that? This one stairway is out of line from everything else in the entire Temple Mount. Everything else is rectangular. Why is this crooked? Second question, look at the steps. These are Jerusalem limestone steps. Look at the bottom one. It's wider, and it looks all kind of scraggly, doesn't it? It's all kind of worn out, very different looking, that bottom step. Much older. That has been there a very long time. These are much more recent. Why is that there? Why does it look like that? It has been suggested by one of the best studies that has ever been done on the temple that what you are seeing is the only visible part of Solomon's temple. Wow. That this would be the top of the retaining wall from Solomon's temple, and the reason for that is because Solomon's temple was slightly angled off. The angle was changed with the later temple. So the earlier temple was crooked, and that's why this staircase is crooked. Another piece of evidence which is really interesting. Remember I told you that when you build stuff with stone, you overlap the stone. But when you add on to something that was already built, you get a straight seam. You had already finished, and then you add on here. If you look from the Mount of Olives across at the wall of the modern Temple Mount, what you see is right here a straight seam. So all this is an addition. This was an older construction. You also see it on the top. So this section right here is all much older than the rest of it. You may be seeing at least a piece of the original retaining wall on this side as well. It certainly is much earlier than King Herod's remodeling. That much we can say for sure. Because King Herod basically added all this area, this huge area, expanding the platform much larger up on top of the hill. What you're seeing on the top is the temple in Jesus' time. What you're seeing in the bottom is a reconstruction of the temple in Solomon's time. Okay, so much bigger platform up there. Notice that the yellow is basically the same area that's this yellow up there. So you see how much bigger it was when the remodel was done just before Jesus' time. Here's an artist's depiction of what the Temple of Solomon looked like with those two great bronze pillars. And here's kind of an overview from the south of the whole Temple Mount as it is today. This is a fascinating piece of evidence. Remember the biblical minimalists, and even Israel Finkelstein himself said, I'm not sure if there really was a historical David. I feel like the evidence is too late. If the monumental architecture dates from the next century, maybe David really was a founding myth of some sort. Maybe there really wasn't a historical King David. Well, way up at Tel Dan, the very farthest north site of Israel, we'll be coming back to Tel Dan later on, this stone was found with an Aramaic inscription. It is written not by the Hebrews, it's written by the king of Damascus. Okay? The king was Hazael, king of Damascus, and he wrote this thing, and he says, he's bragging. Kings are usually bragging on these things. I killed Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaz, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. Right here in Aramaic it says Beit David, the house of David. The house of David, what does that mean? It means that not only, and by the way, this dates from a generation after David. Not only is King Hazael of Damascus saying there was a historical David, but David founded a dynasty, the house of David, and the kings of the south were from that house of dynasty. So there you have major corroboration that there was a historical David from just after the time period, and that David formed a dynasty of kings. So here you have serious corroboration. Now it really, the biblical minimalists, by the way, tried to claim that this was a forgery. A lot of examination was done of it. It is not. I think we can say quite certainly now this is not a forgery, and therefore the argument that there was not a historical David is really a dead argument at this point. really nobody's making that argument anymore. So there we have it. The three gates, the monumental architecture, the evidence, when you put it all together from all three of them, combined now with the new finds for a major palace in Jerusalem dating from the time of King David, suggests that indeed these gates do date from the time of Solomon, and that they do point to a historical King David, historical King Solomon, who did have a lot of power in their time, did have the capacity to engage in monumental architecture, and thus the portrayal of them, and the very specific portrayal that Solomon built those three cities, as well as temple, etc., actually fits pretty darn well with the state of our knowledge, the problem of the 10th century. The problem of the 10th century isn't completely solved. There are a number of other riddles, and there's still arguments about details and so on. And Finkelstein is still holding out because he knows he can sell books a lot if he does. But it does appear, and by the way, even the conference I went to 10 years ago, the majority of archaeologists were saying, I don't think, I respect Finkelstein, but I don't think he has it right. And now the tables have really been tipped, especially for the finding of this palace. So I think the problem of the 10th century may be much less of a problem these days, but just wanted you to be aware of kind of the lay of the land. If you hear about these things, that's what's going on. We want to take these problems seriously. We don't want to just dismiss them out of hand, but at least this is the state of the question as I understand it.
What happens to archaeologists that make these claims not so true?
Oh, good question. What happens to archaeologists when they make claims that don't sort of hold up over time? Well, you hope that they'll be really honest and say, okay, you don't vote. People make their arguments, and you have people who just love being somebody to stir people up. And when you think of it, Finkelstein did a great service to everybody. By making his arguments, he made people more thoughtful, sharper, dig deeper, etc. And even if they don't agree with him, they respect him. It's been a good argument. Some elements of the argument go on, and everybody learns from it, and everybody gains. That said, it's not uncommon for people to get stubborn. And I'm going to hold out no matter what. And even when everybody else says I'm wrong, I know I'm right. And you get that kind of stuff. It's human nature. And so you do get. And I wasn't quite joking about selling books. The more you can stir up controversy, the more people feel like, oh, I've got to read that guy, right? And so it does sell books. So publishers want to stir up controversy as much as anybody because it sells books. So there is that as well. I don't think that Finkelstein has caved yet. And he's probably about retirement age now, so he probably never will, I suspect. But certainly the dialogue goes on. And there, a certain degree of consensus gets built around these things. And I was really surprised even a few years ago that consensus was starting to gathering respectful consensus, but consensus that Finkelstein was wrong, that the evidence pointing in that direction. But they're good arguments to have. Okay, so we're done with the 10th century. Now, where are we going? Number 4.
Question?
Yeah.
What's your opinion about, you feel there's a lot of atheists trying to use archaeology to prove that they are right, and there's a lot of Christians or the other, or not Christians, or the other people trying to prove they're right, standing against each other, just fighting each other, and then trying to prove that you're wrong, I'm right, whatever. Is that, or is it more or less for trying to figure out the real truth?
It's a really good question. I would say yes to all of the above. Really. I mean, you certainly do have people with an atheistic bias trying to, beat people over the head with something. You certainly have people with a religious bias trying to beat people over the head with and their bias will color their approach to the evidence. You certainly have a quest for the truth among all of them, but they have their biases, they have their assumptions, and they disagree about some of those things. And you have some people who are just trying to stir up controversy and just trying to make trouble, and And you also have, there's a school of thought now that's very popular among Israeli archaeologists in particular, which is forget the Bible. In fact, you're not doing good archaeology if you ever read the Bible. Don't read the Bible. Don't look at the Bible. Don't look at any ancient texts. Just do the archaeology and just interpret what's on the ground and nothing else. And that's where you're going to find the truth. And ignore the written text altogether. That seems to be overkill. And again, most people aren't buying it. But there are some people who are really pressing that issue. And that issue does seem to be pressed by atheists more than other people. But it's all, anything you can say about humans, you can say about archaeologists. The one thing I can say is that if you ever get a chance and to go to Israel, go to other places, and if you get a chance, one of the real treats is to get archaeologists who work at a site to take you around the site. And the thing is, they love it. It's their baby. And they love sharing it with you. They love taking you around and showing you all the little things that other people wouldn't notice and that kind of stuff. It is really a delight to get to tour a site with the chief archaeologist. So if you ever get that chance, I do a lot of those kinds of tours when I'm working at Bethsaida. A group will come in and want to see it or whatever, and I'll take them around and show them all the little things that people wouldn't notice. And I've done that a number of places. It's really a delight. So I get to, whenever I take groups to these places, I can show them all the little things, that otherwise would blur right by you. Okay, now let's talk about, we're going to talk now text. Okay, so we're going to leave the dirt for a while, and we're going to go to textual matters. We're going to do this one fairly quickly, but I want you to get a feel for it anyhow. So what we're trying to do is, there we go. What we're trying to do is place the books of 1st and 2nd Kings in the larger literary context of the Old Testament. Okay, so we're doing literature now. And there is an argument that is very common among biblical scholars, and that is that the books of 1st and 2nd Kings do not stand alone as a literary composition. In fact, they're part of something bigger. And that bigger thing is called the Deuteronomistic history. Try to say that. Deuteronomistic history. Yeah, I know. Just say DH. DH. All right, DH. So, we'll talk about the theory, then we'll talk about the evidence, and then we will do some evaluation. So first of all, the theory. The theory is that the book of Deuteronomy was super powerful and influential in Hebrew literature. It sort of set an agenda for our later books. In particular, the Deuteronomistic history. That's why we call it that. It is rooted in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is the key. The theological basis for the DH comes entirely from Deuteronomy. What is the DH? The DH, as most people talk about it, I don't entirely agree, but as most people talk about it, the DH consists of the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They are all one. Right? They're all one combined literary composition. If they are all one, then of course they cannot be written until the last one's done. So the entire thing, the entire DH, was put together in the Babylonian exile. So somebody in the Babylonian exile, because of course the book of 2 Kings ends with the Hebrews being exiled, so it has to be after that. So you have somebody a Hebrew sitting in the exile who creates the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. That person, though, they don't call that person the author. That person is the redactor, the editor. Because, according to this theory, this person who put these books together was working with lots of earlier sources. So if you will, these books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, they are all sort of stitched together from older writings that this person sitting in the exile had available. Okay, so you have a post-exilic redactor who has multiple sources. Now, when you think about the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and you start thinking about the sources for those books, you might start to say, oh, that's what they were talking about. For example, how many references to this is going on to this day? How many times do you see that in those books? Yeah. To this day. Yeah. And you might say, what day? Ah, good. Right? Or all the rest of the deeds of Ahab, are these not recorded in the books of the annals of the kings of Israel? Right? That is, whoever's putting this thing together has a copy of those annals, and they're selecting from it and putting stuff in there and saying there's other stuff that I didn't include here, go look at it. Well, so when you start to think in these terms, a lot of those little things that you notice in the text, they start to make sense, don't they? So that's the theory. Now let's test it, shall we? And let's look at the substance, the evidence for the theory. First of all, of course, we need to look at Deuteronomy. What is this Deuteronomic basis for the rest of these books? So, three main things: ideal of worship, behavioral standards, and the ideal leader. So, we need a mic and we need some readers. So I want somebody volunteer Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 7. Will somebody volunteer? All right, we have one. Somebody volunteer this one, Deuteronomy 30. Can I get somebody else? All right, Deuteronomy 30, be ready. Deuteronomy 17, who'll do that? All right, over here. So, you three be ready. We'll start here. If you get the mic, very good. So we'll just have the readings. We're going to do a lot of readings, so you might want to pull out your text and look at them. And let's start with Deuteronomy 12.
These are the decrees and regulations you must be careful to obey when you live in the lands that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must obey them as long as you live. When you drive out the nations that live there, you must destroy all the places where they worship their gods, high on the mountains, up on the hills, and under every grown tree. Break down their altars and smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherah poles, and cut down their carved idols. Completely erase the names of their gods. Do not worship the Lord your God the way these pagan people worship their gods. Rather, you must seek the Lord your God at the place of worship He Himself will choose from among all the tribes, the place where His name will be honored. There you will bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your sacred offerings, your offerings to fulfill a vow, your voluntary offerings, and your offerings of the firstborn animals of your herds and flocks. There you and your families will feast in the presence of the Lord your God, and you will rejoice in all you have accomplished because the Lord your God has blessed you.
Okay, so there's a negative and a positive to this. So what are you supposed to not do? Don't worship like the other nations. And where do they worship in particular? High places. And they worship at high places, and they also have like poles. Notice the mention of a pole? They have poles, they have high places, they have altars. Get rid of that stuff. Right? This is idolatry. This is the stuff of idolatry. The positive is what? What are you supposed to do? Worship only at the place the Lord chooses. And what is that place going to be? The temple in Jerusalem. So notice, don't worship the high places. Worship in the temple. Don't worship in idolatry. Worship the way I tell you. Okay, that's the ideal of worship. Keep that in mind. Second, Deuteronomy 30.
Now listen, today I'm giving you a choice between life and death, between prosperity and disaster. For I command you this day to love the Lord your God and to keep His commands, decrees, and regulations by walking in His ways. If you do this, you will live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you and the land you are about to enter and occupy. But if your heart turns away and you refuse to listen, and if you are drawn away to serve and worship other gods, then I warn you now that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live a long, good life in the land you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. Today I have given you the choice between life and death, between blessings and curses. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice you make. Oh, that you would choose life so that you and your descendants might live. You can make this choice by loving the Lord your God, obeying Him, and committing yourself firmly to Him. This is the key to your life. And if you love and obey the Lord, you will live long in the land the Lord swore to give your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay, notice please that so this has to do with the relation between the people and the land. You know that's very important to the Hebrews. It's very important to their identity. The relation between the people and the land, but the relation between the people and the land is conditional. You will live long and prosper in the land if, thank you, can't do it, there. Live long and prosper. You will live long and prosper in the land if what? You obey. If you live according to the commands of the Lord. Otherwise, not. Next reading, 17.
You're about to enter the land the Lord your God has given you. When you take it over and settle there, you may think we should select a king to rule over us like the other nations around us. If this happens, be sure to select as king the man the Lord your God chooses. You must appoint a fellow Israelite. He may not be a foreigner. The king must not build up a large stable of horses for himself or send his people to Egypt to buy horses, for the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt. The king must not take many wives for himself, because they will turn his heart away from the Lord, and he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself. When he sits on the throne as king, he must copy for himself this body of instruction on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. He must always keep that copy with him and read it daily as long as he lives. That way he will learn to fear the Lord his God by obeying all the terms of these instructions and decrees. This regular reading will prevent him from becoming proud and acting as if he's above his fellow citizens. It will also prevent him from turning away from these commands in the smallest way, and it will ensure that he and his descendants will reign for many generations in Israel.
Okay, so there's again a negative and a positive. What is the good king not to do? Not many wives, not a lot of wealth, not a lot of horses. That's military strength. Okay, don't do that. What is he supposed to do? Positive. That's right. He's supposed to join DBS. Right? All right, so at least you're qualified. You're all being qualified for monarchy at this point. Yeah. Just to be clear. Now, do you have many horses? No. Many wives? No. Many riches? No. Oh. Wow, we got a bunch of potential kings and queens here. This is good. Good. Unfortunately, you won't find many such people among the Hebrews, at least when it comes to kings, right? So, there's our ideals. So on the basis of these standards, the ideal of worship in the right place, the ideal of behavior, the ideal of what a good king is like, on the basis of these things, the people of Israel will thrive or not over time. The theory of the DH now says, take a look at now the rest of those books, and you will see that all the leaders are judged by these standards. That Deuteronomy is always just lurking in the background, and they're being judged by these particular standards and not others, and that's why we call it the DH. So the DH is a history, but a very particular kind of history, a kind of history that is set by these standards, and it's going to judge the quality of a king based upon these standards. Make sense? And right away, lots of light bulbs should be going on based upon what you just read. Okay, so how does it hold up? How does this theory work for us? Well, let's see about the evidence in Joshua. So now I'm going to need some more readers. New readers. I need somebody for Joshua 24. All right, Joshua 24. Somebody for Judges 3. Yeah. 1 Samuel 15. I can do it. All right. We got our readers. Who was first? I already lost track. All right, we need a mic over here. Who's got the mic?
So fear the Lord and serve him wholeheartedly. Put away forever the idols your ancestors worshipped when they lived beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt. Serve the Lord alone. But if you refuse to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. Will you prefer the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or will it be the gods of the Amorites in the land in whose land you now live? But as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. The people replied, we would never abandon the Lord and serve other gods, for the Lord our God is the one who rescued us and our ancestors from slavery in the land of Egypt. He performed mighty miracles before our very eyes. As we traveled through the wilderness among our enemies, he preserved us. It was the Lord who drove out the Amorites and the other nations living here in this land. So we too will serve the Lord, for he alone is our God. Then Joshua warned the people, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy and jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you abandon the Lord and serve other gods, he will turn against you and destroy you, even though he has been so good to you. But the people answered Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. You are a witness to your own decision, Joshua said. You have chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, they replied, we are witnesses to what we have said. All right then, Joshua said, destroy the idols among you and turn your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. The people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God. We will obey him alone.
Okay. Now I have to tell you, you've just studied the book of Joshua, right? Recently? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about here. I had to hunt in the book of Joshua. That is, this passage is unique in Joshua. Nothing else in Joshua speaks this kind of language. Here you see a pretty clear connection with that ideal of worship, right? Get rid of the pagan gods. But if you also remember, the rest of the narrative of Joshua doesn't pay any attention to that at all. Hardly. I mean, that's just not an issue that keeps coming up. It's right here at the end of the book of Joshua, but not in other places. For this reason and for several other reasons, I'm cheating a little bit by having you read this passage because it kind of stands out in the book of Joshua. It's not typical of the book of Joshua. Now, would somebody read Judges 3, where we will read something typical of the book of Judges?
The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot about the Lord their God, and they served the images of Baal and the Asherah poles. Then the Lord burned with anger against Israel, and he turned them over to King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim.
Close, Naharaim.
Naharaim.
Mm-hmm.
And the Israelites served
him
for 8 years. But then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Othniel, the son of Caleb's younger brother, Kenaz. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he became Israel's judge. He went to war against King, that dude, of Aram, and the Lord gave Othniel victory over him. So there was peace in the land for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Okay.
Now this is, you've just studied Judges, so you know what I'm talking about here. This is the typical cycle, isn't it? I like the R's. The rebellion, repression, repentance, and restoration. You like that? You can do different letters for that, but you get this cycle, right? And the cycle starts with what? How does the rebellion start? What sin? Worshipping the other gods, right? Violating the Deuteronomistic standards. And therefore, you start this cycle, and the repression is caused by a foreign king, right? In other words, the idolatry is the cause, violating Deuteronomy. The effect, the punishment, is oppression by a foreign power. Then there's the repentance and the restoration caused by the rising up of a judge. And you remember in the book of Judges, you follow this pattern, about 32 times, right? You keep following this cycle. This just happens to be a short version of the same thing. So there you see something very typical of the book of Judges, and it is typically idolatry, turning to other gods, worshiping the Asherah poles, etc., is the cause of the problem. So Judges fits fairly well with our model, doesn't it, of Deuteronomy. How about 1 Samuel? Who's got, here we go, Joshua, 1 Samuel.
Then Samuel said to Saul, "Stop, listen to what the Lord had told me last night." "What did he tell you?" Saul asked. And Samuel told him, "Although you may think of little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord has anointed you king of Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, until they are all dead. Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? But I did obey the Lord. I carried out the mission Saul insisted. I carried out the mission he gave me. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everyone else. Then my troops brought in the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, and plunder to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. But Samuel replied, what is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. So because you have rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Then Saul admitted to Samuel, yes, I have sinned. I've disobeyed your instructions and the Lord's command, for I was afraid of the people and did what they have demanded. But now, please, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel replied, I will not go back with you. Since you have rejected the Lord's command, he has rejected you as king of Israel.
Okay, so Saul violated the standard of Deuteronomy, didn't he? He was supposed to follow the commands of the Lord. He disobeyed the commands of the Lord. He's supposed to get rid of the idolatry. He, in fact, created the conditions for the perpetuation of the idolatry, and because of this, the Lord rejected him as king. So here you see a king being judged by the standards of Deuteronomy. Fits pretty well, doesn't it? Okay. Let's go on. How about 1st and 2nd Kings? Does it fit our model of the DH? So I need 4 more readers. So somebody over here, give me 1 Kings 16. Who will do it? Okay, please send the mic over there. 1 Kings 22. Somebody over here. Actually, 22 and 23. Somebody over here. Yeah, okay. 2 Kings 24. Somebody over here. Okay, and 2 Kings 25. Somebody over here. Somebody anywhere. Okay, thank you. Okay, so 1 Kings 16.
But Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. He followed the example of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and all the sins he had committed and led Israel to commit. The people provoked the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, with their worthless idols. The rest of the events in Omri's reign, the extent of his power, and everything he did are recorded in the book of history of the kings of Israel. When Omri died, he was buried in Samaria. Then his son Ahab became the next king.
Okay, so this is your classic judgment formula that you see over and over again in 1st and 2nd Kings. The king judged against the standards of Deuteronomy, and Omri did what? Evil, right? He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, primarily because of violating the standards with respect to idolatry. 2 Kings 22.
Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother was Jedidah, the daughter of Adiah from Bozkath. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight and followed the example of his ancestor David. He did not turn away from doing what was right.
Okay, and then go on to 23, 19 to 25, and we'll continue Josiah.
Is that someone else or is that me?
That's you.
Double portion.
23, 19 to 25.
All right. Then Josiah demolished all the buildings at the pagan shrines in the towns of Samaria, just as he had done at Bethel. They had been built by the various kings of Israel and had made the Lord very angry. He executed the priests of the pagan shrines on their own altars, and he burned human bones on the altars to desecrate them. Finally, he returned to Jerusalem. King Josiah then issued this order to all the people. You must celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God as required in the Book of the Covenant. There had not been a Passover celebration like that since the time when the judges ruled in Israel, nor throughout all the years of the kings of Israel and Judah. This Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem in the 18th year of King Josiah's reign. Josiah also got rid of the mediums and psychics, and the household gods, the idols, and every other kind of detestable practice, both in Jerusalem and throughout the land of Judah. He did this in obedience to the laws written in the scroll that Hilkiah the priest had found in the Lord's temple. Never before had there been a king like Josiah, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and soul and strength, obeying all the laws of Moses. And there has never been a king like him since.
Okay, so here we have one of the very few kings who gets a positive judgment. And the positive judgment is based on what? What did he do that made him a good king? Got rid of the other gods, including destroying the places of worship. And what else? What?
Restoration of Passover.
Restoration of Passover, based upon what? What law? The book that he was studying. Remember? Read it before, that he's supposed to make a copy of the book and be studying it all the time? He was doing his DBS homework. Right? And he said, oh, Passover, what's that? We haven't done that. Let's do that. So it's the combination. It's the combination of the negative and the positive, right? Getting rid of the idolatry, but also promoting the honoring of God based upon the written text. So this is a classic case of the standards of Deuteronomy. By the way, I should tell you that it is very common in Old Testament circles for people to argue, I don't agree with this, but it's pretty common for people to argue that the book of Deuteronomy was in fact written at this time. That is, it was written to instruct Josiah. So that's a very late date argument for the writing of Deuteronomy. But just so you know, it's a very common argument that's out there. I think it's much older, and indeed he's rediscovering the Torah, because that's what it says. It says he rediscovered the book of the law, which I take to be, book of the law means the book of Torah. That would be the 5 books, not just one. But some people argue that it was actually created during this period of time. So just so you know that that's a common argument out there. In any case, you can certainly see that Josiah fits perfectly the mold of the good king from Deuteronomy. Let's see, 24, 2 Kings 24.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not pardon.
Okay, so these foreign powers coming in and oppressing the Israelites here as we approach the end of the kingdom of Judah, these are sent by the Lord because of what? Because of the sin they had been doing, and very particularly what sin? Idolatry again. The shedding of innocent blood is referring to child sacrifice to pagan gods, which Manasseh, if you remember, Manasseh did that. Passed his son through the fire, as he said. Okay, and then finally 2 Kings 25.
In the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin of Judah, evil Merodach ascended to the Babylonian throne. He was kind to Jehoiachin and released him from prison on April the 2nd of that year. He spoke kindly to Jehoiachin and gave him a high place in all the other exiled kings in Babylon. He supplied Jehoiachin with new clothes to replace his prison garb and allow him to dine in the king's presence for the rest of his life. So the Babylonian king gave him a regular food allowance as long as he lived.
Okay, so you hear this. This is the end of the book, right? This would be the if the DH theory is true, this is the end of this grand composition. And what's the end of this grand composition? It ends with a big question mark. Here is Jehoiakim in captivity, being freed from prison, eating at the table of the Babylonian king, and the book ends. It ends with this big question mark. What will be the next step? Will the Israelites finally get it and turn to the Lord and abide by the standards of Deuteronomy, or will they not? The book ends with this grand question mark. So, what do we make out of all of this? What is our evaluation of the DH theory? I will tell you that I think there is a good deal to be said for it, but we have to be careful about what we're talking about. The book of the DH, if such a thing exists, or these books at least, represent a particular type of history writing. I know that one of the things that you do, that your staff will press you upon regularly, is pay attention to literary genre. Have you talked about this? Yes. Pay attention to literary genre. You can learn to expect certain things about literary genre. And one of your choices is historical narrative, right? Historical narrative. Okay, that's cheating. Right? Okay, yeah. These texts we've just been reading, these are historical narrative, aren't they? They're all that genre. But remember, I'm a historian. When it comes to historical narratives, there's very different kinds. There's very different kinds of history writing. And we want to be pretty particular about what kind of history writing are we looking at here. I would suggest to you that there are basically 5 kinds of history writing. I'm oversimplifying even with this, but at least to give you some basic sense. There's basically 5 kinds of history writing. 5 kinds of historical narratives. And they divide upon their relationship, the relationship of the writing to the events that they're writing about. Okay? When you think about it, no historian writes about everything in a historical period. Historical narratives are always selections. You always choose to write about some things and not others. And they are always composed from a perspective, right? The author brings a particular perspective, asks certain questions, and writes about certain things, and includes some things and not others. So we see those multiple references to the annals of the kings of Israel. What are they saying? What the author is saying is, I chose to include this stuff. I didn't choose to include other stuff. If you want to read the other stuff, go read it. Right? So that's pretty standard. And you choose the stuff you choose for a reason. Whatever combination of human desire and divine inspiration, you make choices. So, that's always what historians do. And when they compose within the larger genre of historical narrative, they compose a text in a certain way. So, one extreme is the journal article. I've written lots of journal articles. Journal articles are highly technical, highly precise, often exhaustive analyses of the evidence. You ask a question, you dig up the evidence, you look at every possible bit of evidence, you look at it from multiple angles, and you try to answer your question the best you can based upon the evidence. Now, most of you have probably never read a journal article by a historian, and you can count your blessings. They tend to be boring. They tend to be really complicated. They tend to be very complex. They tend to be lots and lots of footnotes because they're always paying careful attention to the evidence. If you want, I can show you some of the things I've read. You can be really bored that way. But they are sure cures for insomnia. So if you're having trouble sleeping, just pull that baby out and you'll be good. Journal articles were never written in the ancient world. These are the standards of the modern professional historian, and we are trying to be as thorough and detailed and answer the question as carefully as we possibly can. Yes, we're being selective. Still we have our own biases. Still we have our own questions and our own perspectives. But nevertheless, we think we have something to offer to the rest of the field by diving into really great detail on this particular question. So for example, I wrote one journal article on when was Jesus born. 52 pages later, I had it maybe figured out, sort of. Anyhow, but it's complicated. It's a really complicated question. So that's a journal article. Nobody in the ancient world wrote like that. The objective of a journal article is to be highly objective, highly precise, highly detailed. Nobody ever thought that way in the ancient world. So we shouldn't expect them to. Okay? So let's scratch that one off the list. When we're talking about ancient history, people didn't write like that. Modern historians do. So we know it exists, but ancient people didn't do that. So don't expect ancient historians to be writing like that. They don't do it. At the other extreme is things we write or tell about Santa Claus. Now here I have to speak to, I realize that American tradition is different from other countries' traditions about these things. I wrote a history of Santa Claus. So, it's a journal article. But Santa Claus, we tell lots of stories about Santa Claus. Americans love Santa Claus. Santa Claus holds reign over the United States for 3 weeks out of every year from shopping malls. Right? Santa Claus drives the American economy. The stories we tell about Santa Claus, in fact, have a historical foundation. There was such a man, St. Nicholas of Myra. He was a Christian bishop in Turkey about 300 AD. But the stories we tell about Santa Claus have very little to do with that historical figure, Santa Claus. In fact, the stories we tell about Santa Claus are very American, and they have to do with a guy who lives in the North Pole and hangs out in a snowsuit and hangs out and, flies around with reindeer and gives out gifts. And by the way, he hangs out at shopping malls for a purpose because he wants you to buy stuff and stimulate the economy. He has been a champion of major advertising campaigns. It's all very American. It's all very commercial. But the thing is, it's not false. The stories we tell about Santa Claus are not false. They are historical narratives. But the historical narratives are only loosely connected to the original St. Nicholas of Myra, the Bishop of Turkey. They have more to do with other things. This is highly embellished historical narrative with a very different purpose than telling what actually happened to St. Nicholas of Myra. That's the loosest possible kind of historical narrative. So journal articles are on one extreme, the tightest possible historical narrative, and Santa Claus stories are on the other extreme, the loosest possible. Their connection to the actual history of St. Nicholas of Myra is pretty loose. Ancient historical narratives reside in between those two poles, somewhere. And so some other examples. A textbook. If you probably have pulled out a historical textbook at one time or another. Maybe you look at a history of Israel, or maybe you looked at a New Testament history or something like this, and you look at a history textbook. A history textbook is a superficial history. It is loose, it ignores a lot of things, it has to be very selective. You try to tell a story really short that's much more, you oversimplify, everything is much more complicated than it looks. You try to do justice to the evidence, but you're only working within a limited amount. You've got to use language that's easily understood by a broad audience, or it won't sell as a textbook. So you're trying to do justice to the evidence reasonably, but you're fudging all around the edges because you're trying to fit it into something that's going to be readable and accessible by a lot of people. It is not a journal article, not even close. But it's also not a Santa Claus story, right? You are trying to stay pretty tightly connected to the events at the time and reconstruct them based upon the evidence, but you know you're not going to do justice to all the evidence. You're going to be fudging left and right. That's a textbook. Then, in my culture, there's Abraham Lincoln stories. Now, Abraham Lincoln stories are a little bit like Santa Claus stories, but they're a little closer to the evidence. Most Abraham Lincoln stories that are told, Abraham Lincoln was an American president, the 16th president of the United States. He's probably most famous for presiding over the Civil War and wanting to put an end to slavery. Of course, Abraham, that's the way we commonly tell the story. We also, by the way, like to tell the story of Abraham Lincoln as a rags to riches kind of guy. That is, he grew up poor and then grew up to become president, right? So it's kind of a rags to riches story. All these things, there's evidence for all these things. There's truth in all these things. But of course, the reality is much more complicated. For example, most people don't know that Abraham Lincoln was, while he talked about God and quoted the Bible all the time, he was rather ardently anti-Christian. He would not darken the door of a church. That was, he was absolutely opposed to that. He really didn't like the Christianity as he knew it of his day, and he said, "I will not enter a church, and here's why." And yet, if you read his speeches, they're full of quotations from the Bible. They're just beautifully done. They're very impressive in many ways. But Abraham Lincoln, he's a complex guy. Abraham Lincoln was interested in slavery, but he was mostly interested in basically making sure that the people in the South did what he said and didn't break off from the Union. And this has a lot to do with economics and and a lot of other factors. Abraham Lincoln is a very complicated dude. The reality of Abraham Lincoln is not the stories we tell. But we tell stories that do have a connection to reality in certain ways, but they're sort of whitewashed, right? We like the good Abraham Lincoln. We don't like the anti-Christian Abraham Lincoln or whatever, right? And so we tell the stories in a certain way. So this is much looser than a textbook, but it's closer to the real Abraham Lincoln than the Santa Claus stories that we